After we fired our air shot at the Japanese at 9:30 that morning, I wandered up on the signal bridge and stood around. Our flotilla was in tight formation, charging northeast at 20 knots on the trail of our planes. There were several reasons for this, the principal one being that of reducing the length of their flight back to the carrier. In going out more than 200 miles to hit the Japanese, they were operating at the extreme limit of their range and needed any help we could give to shorten that return trip. Captain Sherman, who was living on the bridge in his emergency cabin in these days, told me we had steam raised so that our speed could be stepped up to 30 knots at short order, should this be deemed necessary. We sat in his quarters, speculating on what the morning might hold for us. "There is a possibility," he said, "that the striking forces from both sides, ours and the Japanese, are right now in the air flying to the attack, and that both will get through. I feel that at the present time an air attack group cannot be stopped. It is likely that the position will be similar to that of two boxers, both swinging a knockout punch at the same time, and both connecting." Later in the day, I was to think of these words and the accuracy with which they summed up the situation. The captain knew his stuff, and very evidently had weighed all the chances. He was fully aware of the facets in this sea-air war that is so new to the rest of the world, but not to these two opponents. The bridge of an aircraft carrier is the place from which to see the action, because everything of importance occurs either in the air around the ship or on the long, narrow flight deck that stretches away toward the bow and the stern. The signal bridge on the Lexington was a 6-foot-wide open veranda around the island on the starboard side. It was 25 feet above the flight deck, which itself rose 50 feet above the sea. 10 or 12 feet above the signal bridge was a smaller open veranda, affording the admiral and his staff a post of observation. Finally, above that was a tiny little crow's nest, known as the Sky Forward Lookout. The island was a light, unarmoured structure. From the deck, about 30 feet behind the island, arose the vast smoke funnel, which consolidated within its steel false structure the tubes carrying smoke and fumes from the ship's 16 huge boilers, from her ventilating system and from her galleys. The funnel was carried to 60 feet above the flight deck, and around its upper rim was an iron catwalk with a platform at either end. The after platform was a lookout position known as Sky Aft. Round the catwalk were searchlights, signal lights, camera mounts for the ship's photographers, and other posts. The signal bridge is the captain's country. Connected to it from every compartment in the ship are telephone lines and voice tubes. It is the heart and brain of the ship. Everything that happens on the vessel is reported directly to the captain. From inside the ship, the reports come by telephone. From outside, where lookouts and signalmen always are on duty, they come in the form of notes written on signal pads. The bridge itself extends clear around the island. The enclosed portion to the bow is the wheelhouse where the helmsman and officer of the watch are forever on duty. With them are messengers. The captain's emergency cabin is just behind the wheelhouse, and behind that again is the chart room, the office of the ship's navigating officer. This morning the bridge was stripped for action. It meant that the heavy plate glass windows around the wheelhouse had been unlatched and slid down into the sills, leaving it open all around. Today the ship's navigating officer, Commander James R. Dudley, was on duty in the wheelhouse, where he was noting every change of course. With him were Commander Seligman, the ship's executive officer, and the communications officer, Commander Winthrop Terry. Outside on the bridge was the ship's air officer, Commander Herbert Ducky Duckworth, and Lieutenant Commander Edward H. Eldridge, ship's air staff. Marines, orderlies, and signalmen made the bridge a crowded place. In the chart room an ensign and the chief quartermaster logged in the permanent big book the speed and direction of the ship with every change, plus the time these changes were made. A stranger looking on could not have identified the officers from the enlisted men. Everyone habitually there was deeply tanned, and everyone, from the admiral down to the newest orderly, that morning wore working clothes. For Admiral Fitch and Captain Sherman, this consisted of khaki, Navy-issue canvas windbreakers with a zipper front over a khaki shirt, cotton drill trousers of khaki, and battle bonnets, the new roundhead-type steel helmets. So was everyone else on the bridge, wearing helmets and either blue denim coveralls or khaki shirt and pants. The helmets are particularly good in the tropics because they have a papier-mâché liner, which can be worn as a sun helmet when there is no danger of flying fragments. But today, by order, Everyone on the flight deck or above wore a helmet, and everyone had to keep nearby his post the Navy-issue life jacket. Most of these are kapok vests. The flyers, and anyone with wings, which included the captain, seligman, and of course everyone connected with flying operations, had the new rubberized Mae Wests, which can be inflated either with little compressed gas bottles, the kind you use in a soda siphon, or blown up by lung power. These are worn deflated until needed. Early in the morning I met the chaplain hunting through the cabins for a battle bonnet. He had obtained permission of Commander Seligman to watch from the bridge whatever action came our way. The permission, however, was contingent upon his being able to find a helmet. It turned out that he was not able to procure one, and so missed a grandstand view of the last and greatest battle that the Lexington fought. Captain Sherman had a little solid black cocker spaniel named Admiral Wags aboard ship with him. Normally Wags was always at the captain's heels, but as the little pup was terrified by the sound of the ship's guns whenever these were fired, he was put on an extended leash anchored in the skipper's emergency bedroom. The line was just long enough to allow him to poke his nose into the chart room or see onto the bridge. This arrangement was his battle station. He was put there about 10 o'clock, and for some time afterward he showed a mournful nose and ear at the door. It was here that I found him after the Japanese attack subsided, and where after a fresh bowl of water and a pet I was able to quiet him down. In addition to zigzagging, the Lexington was frequently moving out of the centre of the fleet formation when she turned into the wind, which happened to be about north-northwest, to launch or take aboard aircraft of her defence screen. This meant a left turn for the big ship every time, and frequently carried her outside of the cruiser and destroyer screen on our port side. These ships were holding their fleet position and disregarding the Lexington's manoeuvres. Captain Sherman had at his command, for the defence of his vessel, 8 fighters and 8 scouts. A similar force had been retained by Carrier 2, and in addition to the primary job of guarding the carriers, inevitably the most important targets, these planes also were guarding to some extent the escort vessels in the flotilla. This day Captain Sherman cut his fighter and scout groups in half. 4 fighters and 4 scouts were aloft constantly while their counterparts were refueling on deck, rotating at brief intervals so all could fight at any time with maximum loads of fuel and ammunition. The fighters with their supercharged engines were given the high-level watches whence enemy dive bombers probably would appear, and the scouts were ordered to watch for low-level torpedo planes. The first alarm on the Lexington came at 10 o'clock when 12 ghosts unidentified planes were reported approaching from ahead. These never did come into sight, and we never knew who or what they might have been. During the next half hour, after we were certain they were not coming our way, I dropped below for a cup of coffee. I found the ship absolutely emptied of her crew. Battle stations take every man, right down to the mess boys who pass ammunition, to some fighting post. And I had a quiet few minutes in the senior wardroom. I returned to the bridge in time to hear the second alarm, which came in at 10:50 a.m. One of the scouts called, "Katie to carrier. Big force of enemy aircraft coming in from right ahead. They are 60 miles away." The message went out over the ship's loudspeaker system, and every man aboard instantly realized we were in for a knockdown, drag-out battle with the Japanese air squadrons. I remembered that Captain Sherman, while we were talking in his cabin, had told me he believed the Japanese would arrive, if at all, about 11 o'clock. Just one more point on which the skipper was dead right. The Lexington, following the captain's orders, began a port turn into the wind so that all the airplanes then in reserve on the decks could get off. While we were launching the last of our scouts and fighters, I looked over at Carrier 2, 2 miles away on our starboard beam, where the same scene was being enacted. Both ships were getting every plane and gun into the air, for both captains realized that the only real defense against an airplane is another airplane. I could feel the change in vibration as the Lexington's big propellers speeded up to give us the last knot. This greater speed is needed for swift maneuvering, which is really a ship's best defense. And as I looked down from the bridge into the nests of light automatic cannon on the flight deck, I saw the gun teams standing by their pieces holding extra shell clips and eagerly looking ahead and upward in the direction from which the enemy was expected. About this time a great deal began to happen. Thinking back later, I realize 1,001 impressions were registering that I was not even conscious of at the time. Chiefly, I was busy for the next few minutes getting my microphone and telephone circuits straightened out. With lightning suddenness, the fleet was in the direst danger. 1 minute we had been shouldering our way through the coral sea billows in what might have been a pleasure cruise. The next we were prepared to fight for our lives. Such is the speed of sea-air war in this year of our Lord. Perhaps the only way to give an approximately true picture of the speed of events in the next crowded minutes is to take the timetable of the action as I jotted it into my little pocket notebook as the battle thundered all around. From these jottings, some hours later, I reconstructed everything I had seen and heard, and it is some of this expanded material that the reader will get here. While we were commencing our starboard turn back into the fleet formation, after having launched our last airplane, we heard the voice of Paul Ramsey coming in over the loudspeakers. Agnes to carrier. Enemy planes, 17,000 feet, 4 groups of 9 each. 2 groups dive bombers, each with mixed group of Messerschmitt 109s and 0 fighters in escort. I am at 14,000, 12 miles northeast of you, climbing hard. They are going awfully fast. Doubt if I can intercept. Almost simultaneously we had a call from a scout off in the same direction. Nora to carrier. Enemy torpedo planes, Nakajima 97s, spilling out of a cloud 8 miles out. They are at 6,000 feet in a steep glide. We are intercepting now. Red Gill in the fighter control room was calling all our dispersed defense planes and directed them to concentrate against these oncoming enemies. The loudspeaker was full of orders, calls and notations as the Japanese were sighted by our planes and coming closer by the minute. I can fix the action of the next few minutes accurately from my own and the Lexington's official notes. 11:06 a.m. A huge column of smoke is seen falling into the sea far out on our port beam. Almost instantly we are told a scout has shot down another of those ubiquitous Kawanishi 4-motor snoopers. The crew of this big plane evidently has been directing the Japanese dive and torpedo bombers toward us. This is the 3rd Kawanishi we downed in 4 days, every one of them within sight of the fleet. Each one made a beautiful bonfire in the sky and left a heavy smoke trail. 11:15 a.m. The Lexington, still increasing her speed gradually, is not quite back within the fleet formation. There is only one cruiser on our port side, slightly off our quarter. The destroyers and other cruisers that should be covering that side are astern, ahead, or to starboard of us. Might be better if they were keeping station on us rather than on each other. 11:16 a.m. I am watching that cruiser and suddenly see flames and belching smoke as they fire at something I cannot see. Not until seconds later does the thunderclap of the first shots, and then the steady roll of firing as the cruiser's smaller weapons join in and keep pumping shells reach me. I see winks of flame all over that cruiser from those guns. 11:16:30 a.m. Here they come, sing the lookouts. Enemy torpedo planes off the port beam. The skipper, with a calm glance in that direction, speaks quietly to the helmsman. Hard a starboard. The manoeuvre is intended to swing the Lexington so that she will present only her comparatively narrow stern and beam to the torpedo craft. But in comparison to the speed of those diving silver midges I can now discern low behind the cruiser, the gallant old Lexington seems to be standing still. Even as the captain speaks, they are getting larger and fanning out to cover a wide front as they approach. They are coming in at a scorching pace. I judge that with their dive and wide-open throttles, they probably are doing almost 300 miles an hour. As yet, the Lexington's guns are silent. Now the gunners are beginning to distinguish the 9 planes of this first wave. 2 of them are following a course that will bring them right across that blessed cruiser out there, 2,000 yards off our port quarter. These 2 planes are so low that they have to zoom slightly to pass over her. As they do, one disintegrates in the air, simply disappears as if snatched away by some giant magician. Evidently it has been struck by one of the cruiser's heavier shells, which also exploded the torpedo. The flash of this Japanese blowing up is a beautiful sight. Pretty shooting, boys. That is one that won't make it. About this time, the Lexington's own batteries of more than 100 guns break into flame. There is the sharp wham, 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 wham of the 5 inches, the staccato bark of the 1.1 inches, and the rushing yammer of the 20mm batteries. A hellish chorus, uneven, jerky, but so forceful that it leaves us, there on the bridge, gasping in the partial vacuums created by the blasts. Out on the open bridge, we are above the gun muzzles, and with the first firing, our nostrils are stung by the reeking cordite of the driving charges. Up from the port side of the ship goes a curtain of tracer, winking red and white in the brilliant sunlight. Our light automatics are firing. 11:17 a.m. The Lexington is still swinging. As her slender stern comes round more and more toward them, the Japanese change course slightly, parallel us, and when abreast turn once more toward our port beam. They are riding right in on a hail of the smaller weapons tracer, but they do not seem to falter once. Not even the destruction of their leading plane by our cruiser appears to faze them. By now they are in close to us. The first couple is not more than 800 yards off, and the last within about 1,000 yards. We can see the black blobs of the torpedoes fall away from the planes, their splash as they hit the water, and their trailing foam as their own internal machinery begins to drive their twin propellers and sends them shooting on toward us at 50 knots, just under the surface of the sea. There are still 8 of them coming on in spite of our fire. Each one drops its torpedo, but instead of turning away, they continue straight on in toward us, with the leading pair right down on the water, so low they have to pull up slightly to get over us, following a track that will pass over the forepart of our flight deck. Right here I see the results of all our battery training. The forward 1.1 battery has the range on that first Japanese. I see their shells, bright crimson tracers, tearing through the wings and fuselage. This plane wavers, begins a slow roll to its left and veers off just enough to pass in an inverted position just under our bow. As it glides by, I see flames coming from the tail, and the machine smashes itself into the water 50 feet off our starboard bow. The port forward 5-inch battery, manned by Marines, concentrates its fire on the second Japanese. As this plane zooms to cross almost directly over these guns, they hit it squarely with a shell. The explosion blows it to bits, its engine plunging into the water almost at the foot of the battery. Shreds of its wings and tail surfaces slither along the carrier's deck like sheets of paper swept in front of a gale. I cannot see what happens to the crew, and I am not interested. The remaining 6 silver planes are trying to pass astern. Similar fusillades of fire from our afterguns are concentrating on them, but they seem to be weathering it, and in a second they have zipped past and rapidly are diminishing, snaking in sharp banks to throw off the gunner's aim and staying low as they scuttle away. This first wave has hardly passed when a second appears. They too come from our port quarter, but instead of being low, they are at 1,000 feet or better. I can just make them out, coming down in a 45-degree angle glide. 18:30 a.m. The Lexington shudders under our feet, and a heavy blast spouts mingled flame and water on our port side forward. A torpedo explosion, and we can see the wakes of others streaking toward us. These missiles dropped by those first 8 Japanese are only just now reaching us. I notice that some of them are porpoising, nosing up out of the water and then diving deeply as if their leveling control mechanism had been damaged. Their wicked noses look to me like death incarnate. I have the illusion they are alive and breaking water to peek at us, only to dive again after having made sure of their courses. 11:20 a.m. Wham! Again the whole ship is shaken. Another torpedo, and at the same place on our port bow, another spout of flame enclosed in seawater. While we are still staggering under the lurch as the great old ship heaves and shakes itself, a lookout in sky forward just above the bridge calls out, "Dive bombers." Looking upward into the sun, I see the first dive bomber flattening out, having just released its bomb. The plane is very low, no more than about 800 feet, and I look up in time to see the long black bomb separate from the plane. There is a terrific boom and a blinding flash on the port forward gun gallery. A 1,000-pound bomb has hit among the 3 5-inch guns there, wrecking them all, starting a fire, and annihilating most of the Marines in the gun teams. The second wave of torpedo planes, still untouched by all the fire directed at them, are now dropping their fish. They have come on down to about 200 feet off the water and are still 1,000 yards away. I notice that they are not straightening out, nor flying parallel to the water surface when dropping their missiles. Instead, they are still in their dive and going very fast. This group also comes straight on in toward us and opens up with their machine guns. Their fire, incidentally, is pretty accurate. It annihilated and wounded some of the men on our afterport gun platforms. Can't see whether any of these planes are finally knocked down by us. I do not know, for the action by now is at white heat. Arid all around us are geysers of water several 100 feet high from the dive bombers' near misses. The planes themselves are coming over us at not much more than funnel height, all of them bouncing their machine gun bullets off the decks, the sides of the ships and the lookout positions. At times the whole deck is sprayed with their bright tracers, but most of this fire seems a little too high to hit the exposed gun crew. 11:21 a.m. Balloom! Another torpedo hit, also on the port side, almost amidships. More torpedoes are coursing toward us, their white wakes ghastly warnings of the disaster in the water. The seas seem full of them on our port side. This new batch of torpedoes is porpoising even more than the first lot. 2 of them appear to be certain to hit us right amidships. The trail behind them shows they have been aimed as bullseyes. I glimpsed their nasty black noses about 100 yards out. They looked like sure hits. I brace myself for the explosions, but they do not come. I look out to starboard and see 2 torpedoes break the surface running away from us, still porpoising. They must have passed right under the ship, which means they dived more than 40 feet because the old Lexington, loaded down as she is for war, is drawing at least this much. About this time, a light bomb hits the Lexington's funnel. It explodes and annihilates or wounds several men on the catwalk. A moment later, some of the dive bombers' machine gun fire wounds some more men stationed there. All in all, this turns out to be a pretty dangerous post in the battle. In the midst of all this, I am attempting to dictate into the mic in my left hand and with the other hand make a few scribbles in my notebook while trying to see everything that happens, when a quite illogical thought passes through my mind. There is so damned much noise here I cannot hear any single explosion. It is almost like a complete silence. Hardly has this thought intruded when there is a new sound, the moaning, eerie wail of the Lexington's steam siren. It seems a heavy bomb has passed through the 30-foot gap between the island and the funnel, missed the ship and fallen into the sea on the starboard side. In its passage it struck and kinked the metal tube in which the lanyard, operating the whistle from the bridge, is housed. This glancing blow bent the tube and pulled the lanyard tight, causing the whistle to continue to hoot and moan, the cry of something stricken, which continues until the last of the Japanese have passed over us. Only then someone turned off the steam. Wham! Boom! Tat, 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 tat! Bang, 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 bang! Go our anti-aircraft guns. Then a prolonged wah of the Japanese dive bombers coming down across our deck, all guns blasting. We can see their tracers lacing past, many of them too high to get the deck crew and too low to bother us on the bridge. Another thought flashes through my mind. These fellows do not dive bomb like our boys. They are not coming down as steeply. They are only diving at about a 50-degree angle. As this crosses my brain, I see a black blur whip across in front of the island about bridge high. The object clears the starboard rail by inches, hits the water and explodes. It is one of those big Japanese bombs, a 1,000-pounder that would have removed all of us from the island, the main control center of the entire ship, had the ship's 8-inch barbettes not been removed at war's beginning, for it passed exactly through space where the number 2 barbette used to be. Instinctively I duck behind the bridge rail as it flashes by, and so does everyone else who see it come. Still squatting down behind the weather shield around the bridge, soaked by the geyser of water thrown up by the bomb blast, I reach out and measure between my thumb and forefinger the thinness, 1/8 of an inch of the metal plate. Ensign G.J. Hanson, the signal officer, sees this and reads my mind. "It is not even waterproof, Mr. Johnston. Won't even keep out the spray," he grins. 11:22 a.m. Whoom! Once more the Lexington lurches, the 4th torpedo hit. 11:22:30 a.m. Balloom! The 5th torpedo, all on the port side, amidships and forward. Captain Sherman is watching the torpedoes and dive bombers and swinging the ship, now to starboard, now to port in a snake dance, in an effort to evade the missiles. His orders to the navigating officer and helmsman continue to be in a tone of voice that might have been used in any drawing room. About this time I am passing in front of the wheelhouse. The skipper is standing in front of the wheel, looking out and listening intently to the reports being made to him from all round. As I pass, I catch his eye and brashly enough put my hand out. The captain takes it, and as we shake hands I remark, I think it is going to be all right, Captain. He smiles back and squeezes my hand. I hope so, he says in his quick, quiet way. Looking out to starboard to see how the rest of the ships are faring, I count 5 planes burning on the water. Japanese planes escaping after having dropped their torpedoes or bombs are being followed by our starboard guns pouring tracers into and after them. A huge waterspout leaps up near Carrier 2. My immediate reaction is, she is hit. Later I discover it was a near miss by a huge bomb. Suddenly I see a Grumman following a Japanese as he dives down toward Carrier 2. They disappear into the smoke of the umbrella of bursting heavy anti-aircraft shells and emerge into a literal hail of the machine gun fire thrown up from her decks. The Japanese releases his bomb and begins to flatten out. He bursts into flame as the bullets from our fighter rip into his gas tanks. The Japanese flames into the sea and the Grumman zooms back into the fight. Dive bombers are still coming down, only a second or so apart. Most of the missiles are falling toward the after end of the ship, close, but not quite hitting. Above, we see the Japanese machines diving in a chain. Watching closely, I see the bombs leave each plane. The aircraft follow, gradually flattening out. Their machine guns and wing cannon wink momentarily. Each plane sweeps over the Lexington's deck and then becomes a tiny shape, swiftly diminishing in size as it speeds away. 11:25 a.m. 7 more torpedo planes from the port side. The lookouts call our anti-aircraft fire is so hot now that the pilots in these planes are anxious to drop their fish and get away. They fail to press home their attack like the first groups. All of them are dropping their torpedoes while still in a 45-degree glide and more than 200 feet above the water. They then turn away instead of boring in. They never come closer than within 1,500 yards of the Lexington. Again we swing to avoid the torpedoes. This time it is back to starboard. All the torpedoes seem to be porpoising badly. "Hold her steady, Captain! Hold her steady!" Commander Duckworth suddenly shouts. He is out on the navigation bridge, dancing up and down in his excitement, his arms spread out to each beam as if pressing the torpedoes away with his hands. "We have got 3 alongside, 2 to port and 1 to starboard. They are exactly paralleling us. If we veer," Ducky yells, "we will collect one shore." The skipper holds her straight, and the torpedoes churn slowly on past us. We are doing 25 knots and they are doing 50, so they seem slow anyway. 11:26 a.m. A signalman reports to Captain Sherman that one of our airmen, having been forced to bail out during the fighting, is floating on his little yellow inflated raft through the centre of the speeding fleet. He is just off our starboard bow and only 100 yards from our track. As we sweep past him, I can see him on his knees wildly cheering and waving us on. He is paying absolutely no attention to the Japanese aircraft all around us, and to the flying anti-aircraft stuff zipping past him from our own guns and other guns in the fleet. Captain Sherman glances his way, instantly understanding, and over his shoulder directs a signalman to have our plane guard destroyer, the last one in the fleet, "Pick that boy up." This is done. The destroyer draws alongside him, spins quickly, and as it slides past, engines in reverse, makes a sharp turn, drops him a line, and jerks him aboard. 11:27 a.m. 5 more Japanese torpedo planes suddenly appear. In the confusion, we have not seen them until they are right in the midst of the fleet, but now our anti-aircraft have opened up on them too. These new enemies are almost at water level. They single us out, spread fanwise, and bore into our starboard side, the first attack of the day on our right. With the entire fleet firing on them, they drop their fish a long way out. The old Lexington, still charging ahead despite her wounds, turns once again and all these torpedoes miss her, their feathery wakes lacing the water wide off our bow. 2 more Japanese planes slide in through the fleet's fire, but these turn aside from the Lexington, pass astern of us under the barrage of our anti-aircraft guns, and drop their fish at the cruiser on our port quarter. Accepting the challenge, this smartly handled ship swings quickly, avoiding both torpedoes. The cruiser's gun crew, meanwhile, is pouring its stuff at both the planes, and someone gets a direct hit on one of them. The plane disappears in a clap of thunder and fire. Commander Seligman is intently watching the diving Japanese planes when a Marine approaches, gives a smart salute, and hands him a paper. The commander reluctantly takes his eyes off the attackers and hastily reads the message. Crumpling the paper in his hand, he disgustedly exclaims, "This is a swell time to worry me with this, as if I did not have enough disturbance already." I ask, "What is the bother now?" Without taking his eyes from the bombers, he replies, "Someone wants me to worry because we have a case of measles aboard." 11:32 a.m. The last of the dive bombers roars by, raking us with his machine guns as he passes. His bomb falls close, but definitely not aboard. The guns trail him out of sight. Suddenly there is silence. The attack is over, and despite the hits suffered, the Lexington is afloat, steering normally, and her engines are giving Captain Sherman the speed he asks for. By now, we have a 6-degree list to port, and the lookouts report we are spilling oil in our wake astern. Smoke rising from the gun ports indicates fire inside the hull. The whole attack has lasted only 16 minutes. More than 103 Japanese aircraft have passed over us. Our gunners have made an all-time record by shooting down 19 of the Japanese planes, 19 that we could see from the Lexington's decks. How many more were so badly damaged that they crashed after passing over the horizon, we will never know. 10 minutes after the attack ended, and while our gunners still had itchy trigger fingers, one of our scouts came back. He was flying somewhat erratically and went immediately into the landing circle with wheels and hooked down the landing signal. As the plane flew the downward leg of the landing circle, some of our afterport machine gunners fired a few shots in its direction. They were stopped by others who recognized the type and the insignia. The plane came up astern, too high and too fast, and though waved off by the landing officer, the flyer cut his motor, dropped down on the wet sloping deck, bounced once, touched the left wing tip, and then flipped over the port side. This plane was flown by Ensign R.F. MacDonald with C.H.O. Hamilton as rear gunner. The two had formed part of our anti-torpedo plane screen and had been in some hot air fighting over the horizon. While dueling, MacDonald had been badly wounded in the shoulder and was now trying to land before he lost consciousness. The wound was in his right shoulder, his stick shoulder, and in the ensuing crash, he broke his right arm as well. Both men were picked out of the sea by our plane guard destroyer coming along behind us. MacDonald was sent to a naval hospital to recover from his hurts, and Hamilton was not injured. Now the fighters and scouts began coming back. They were being rearmed and refueled and sent off once more because we had no assurance there would not be another Japanese wave. Shortly after noon, Commander Brett's torpedo squadron returned. As they flew forward on our starboard to get into the landing circle, one of our destroyers let fly a few rounds at them. Fortunately, all these shots missed, and the overanxious gunner was quieted. Brett's 11-plane squadron had only 10 planes when it landed. All his boys had come through the attack safely, except the missing plane, which was forced down into the sea, with dry fuel tanks 30 miles out. A destroyer was sent to get the crew, and all 3 were picked up. The stories of the air fighting which took place in defence of the Lexington began to filter in as reports from our patrols were brought to the bridge. They indicated that our air screens were probably more important to the defence of the ship than the anti-aircraft fire. Ramsey and his fighters had told us earlier that they tried, unsuccessfully, to intercept the first 2 units of Japanese dive bombers. They never caught these planes because the Japanese were above and ahead of Ramsey before they were seen. The fighter escort of the following wave of Japanese dive bombers mixed it with Ramsey's units. One of our fighter pilots told how Ramsey had found himself momentarily in an advantageous firing position near one of the Japanese Messerschmitts in the ensuing melee. He dived on it and fired almost all his ammunition before it started to fall in a spin. In Ramsey's own words, "That fellow was all painted up with yellow and red stripes. He looked like a Christmas tree, almost too pretty to shoot at, but I thought I had better try him. He never did burn, and he took an awful lot of shooting. If they are all going to be like that, it is going to be tough to collect these things." Because the fighters missed the dive bombers, the real air defence was done by the scouts. Our losses among these defenders were heavy, and we never will know the full stories of the sanguinary duelling in which they were downed. But from the survivors came reports of deeds of great valour. Lieutenant Hall, one of the scouts who made the initial interception of the torpedo planes, shot down 2 of the first 9 he encountered. While he was battling these planes, 5 Zeros, probably the escort of the Japanese torpedo craft, Kogakiki 97s, jumped him. Hall turned so effectively on the Zeros that he got 2 of them. His report of the fight regretfully ended. The other 3 escaped into a cloud. In the latter part of this fight, Hall was wounded in both feet by the Zeros, but never let the wounds interfere with his fighting. Our friends Lieutenant Lepler and Gunner Liska were in the thick of this action too. These boys, who on the 7th had bombed an enemy carrier and knocked down 4 Japanese planes, were out in the torpedo defense screen. They intercepted a group of the Kogakikis and knocked one down. Immediately they were surrounded by a flight of Zeros, and in the fight shot down 1 Zero and drove several others off after getting damaging bursts home on the targets. They wrote in their reports that they broke off action when the right forward gun was shot up and the magazine of the left forward gun was empty. There are only 2 forward-firing guns on the Scouts. Limping back to the Lexington, they were again attacked by 2 enemy fighters. Using only the rear guns, this team managed to drive them off, one with its engine smoking badly and obviously damaged. In another fight, Ensign W.E. Wolk intercepted one of the Kogakikis and shot it down. Ensign R.F. Neely got into another torpedo formation and downed 2 planes. 4 scouts from Carrier 2 were shot down by a large Zero formation while they were attacking incoming Japanese torpedo bombers. Just then, a 4-plane fighter group of our Grummans came into the area and in turn jumped the Zeros. 5 of these Zeros were knocked down in 2 passes made by the avenging American pilot. Lieutenant Gaylor collected 2 more Japanese planes before he got home to the Lexington. These were Japanese Kogakikis flying back toward their own base. Gaylor saw them pass, turned and gave chase. He managed to shoot them both down with the last of his ammunition. These 4 victories in one single flight raised this pilot's war score to 8 clean exterminations, most of them against enemy fighter craft. In addition, he received credit for bombing an enemy anti-aircraft installation at Salamaua. When he alighted on the Lexington the afternoon of May 8th, he was the Navy's leading air ace with 3 more confirmed victories than Butch O'Hare, his squadron mate. Lieutenant Morgan and 2 wingmen, also flying fighters on escort duty with the Lexington's dive bombers, had lost contact with their charges, as you may remember from the last chapter. They returned to the Lexington in time to jump into the battle. Morgan intercepted the dive bombers but was himself attacked by their Zero escorts. He set one on fire and saw it crash into the sea. The Japanese craft, he reported, had a belly tank in addition to its regular fuel to give it greater range. A summary of all the day's air fighting, including battles over the Japanese fleet, along the 200-mile sea and air route that was flown by all the forces, and finally the fighting around the Lexington showed that the American flyers had downed 63 Japanese planes. 19 of these were downed by the Lexington's guns and 44 by our aircraft. We lost 16 planes, 8 from the Lexington and 8 from Carrier 2. The Japanese lost 1/3 of their planes according to the best estimates we were able to make. While the flight deck crew were busy servicing the Lexington's air defense planes, Captain Sherman on the bridge began getting the first reports from below decks by approximately 11:45. They came from men who had spent the battle period in engine rooms, battery rooms, the hospital, the various hull compartments and all the departments necessary for the efficient functioning of a ship. These men, officers and crew had been busy long before the battle was ended, trying to offset the damage the Japanese inflicted on the Lexington. Their work began with the fall of the first close bombs and the first torpedo hits. It involved foremost a check-up on all compartments, to isolate those flooded from the rest. It meant they had to struggle, often far below the waterline, cutting and jamming timbers to strengthen bulkheads against the rush and pressure of the invading sea. The first torpedoes exploded against the torpedo bulges up toward the port bow. A torpedo bulge is a false hull constructed along the sides of the ship below the waterline. It is like a blister and is outside the main hull within which the ship's real buoyancy is contained. These blisters are sometimes full of water, often full of some light, non-inflammable filling. They are intended solely to provide a wall around the ship against which torpedoes or mines may hit and explode well away from the real hull. Naturally, such blisters cannot offset hits entirely. The blast tears an enormous hole in the blister, usually punches a smaller hole in the main hull, springs plates and pops rivets or tears nearby welding. But this secondary damage usually impairs a big vessel only to a minor extent. If there were no blisters, a hole, 10 to 20 feet in diameter, might be torn in the main skin. The Lexington had another protection against torpedo blasts consisting of the vessel's enormous oil, gasoline, and water tanks. These were deep vertical tanks running parallel to the side of the ship just inside the hull. Forces applied to the outer skin were often dissipated against the fluids in these tanks, and there was the compartmentation of the hull, a last defence. The Lexington had 600 compartments which could be closed off with watertight doors and hatches. As soon as a leak developed in one of the hull compartments, attempts would be made to plug it. If it was too large or impossible to reach, the doors to this compartment would be closed and the surrounding bulkheads shored up. In effect, these bulkheads and doors then became the ship's side because they were keeping out the sea. In speaking of torpedoes, it should be remembered that these deadly weapons do not penetrate a blister-protected warship's main hull before exploding, as does an armor-piercing bomb or shell. A torpedo hits at only 50 knots velocity, and its supersensitive detonator in its nose bursts the warhead load of explosive at the instant of contact against a ship's side. Consequently, the blast does not reach into the ship's vitals, but is expended against the protected outside hull. In the case of the Lexington, 5 torpedoes struck her within a 4-minute period, all of them on the port side forward of amidships. In one section, 2 of these hits were so close together that the second torpedo seriously damaged the main hull. The net total of loss of buoyancy, plus the weight of water that entered many of the damaged port-side compartments, caused the list about 6 degrees. Commander Pop Healy, with several hundred men in his department, had the specific task of tending to all hull damage. While the Lexington was still in combat, they were working on repairs, and those first accounts of the situation below deck were now, about noon, coming to the captain. Commander Healy reported that explosions among our own 5-inch ammunition, ignited by the heavy bomb on the port 5-inch forward guns, started fires in the Admiral's country. These were being controlled and soon would be out. Their structural damage was immaterial to the ship as a whole. Healy was also optimistic as to the harm done the hull by the torpedo attack and by the mining effect of the heavy bombs that hit close alongside our hull. He was able to state that the compartments were holding and bulkheads strengthened. His men were then busy trying to get things ship-shape in the compartments adjoining those damaged. He promised Captain Sherman that the slight list, which meant little as far as navigating the Lexington was concerned, but was an annoyance and possible source of danger for flying operations, would soon be levelled. He had crew already pumping fuel oil from some of our port tanks into empty ones in the starboard side. This shifting of weight, which can be controlled almost to an ounce, would bring us level in about an hour. He had just one plea. "I would suggest, Captain," he closed his summary, "that if you must take any more torpedoes, take them on the starboard side." So well functioned the damage crew that when the first planes of our air-striking force returned at about 12:40 from their mission against the Japanese force, some 200 miles distant, the pilots could not tell from the air that we had been through an attack. Many were surprised after alighting to hear that we had been bombed, torpedoed, and hit repeatedly by what seemed to be the entire Japanese Naval Air Force. The flight deck of the Lexington had not suffered in the attack except for a small ragged hole in its edge beside the port 5-inch gun gallery where the heavy bomb had struck. By the time our flyers came back, the planes on deck had been wheeled up to the bow, their wings hiding this minor damage. All landings onto a carrier are made over the stern. The slight damage to the deck near the guns in no way interfered with the launching of planes, as it was confined to the outer 6 feet of the deck's edge. The entire deck at that point was more than 100 feet wide. There was no decrease in the Lexington's cruising speed either. She was holding her position with the fleet, doing 25 knots, and could have gone faster, according to Commander Heine Junkers, the chief engineer. He reported that one of the bombs that fell close to the ship near the tail at the time he had thought it was a torpedo hit, because the blast shook the vessel so viciously, put 3 of his fire rooms temporarily out of action. An hour's repair had brought them back into use, and now all 16 boilers were again available. On the bridge, the satisfactory reports from below, and the fact that everything aboard was operating in a normal manner, roused considerable optimism. An officer told me that the designers of the Lexington had claimed she could take 10 torpedoes and still float. It seemed they were right. Nothing appeared to be seriously the matter with the old girl even now. Those near misses, the bombs which exploded close alongside and shook us so violently, having exactly the same effect as mines, and we had more than 10 of those, had not affected her at all, he claimed. The Lexington's medical organization attended to our battle casualties all over the ship. The explosion at the 5-inch forward battery annihilated many men, and burned, shocked and wounded others. The doctors treated these wounded as they were brought away from the gallery where fire still raged, and gave them first aid in the passageways. Then they were sent forward 400 feet and 2 decks below to the ship's hospital right up in the bow. There were numerous other casualties, some amongst the Marines on the port-aft 5-inch guns, from machine gun fire and bomb fragments. Steel singing aboard from near misses had cost us men all along the gun decks. Several were annihilated and injured on the sky-aft funnel position, again from machine gun slugs and splinters, and a number had been overcome by fumes and shock in the ship's decoding room and the supply executive department. The medical crew were having great difficulty in getting the injured down from the funnel catwalk. Lines were rigged, the steel cage stretchers were hauled up, and men who had already been given first aid lashed into them and lowered 60 feet to the flight deck. These stretchers were also useful for helping to get the men around twisting and tortuous spiral steel stairways into the lower decks. From among those I knew well aboard, the first one hurt was jovial Commander Walter Gilmore, the Grand Inquisitor in the wardroom as we crossed the line. The executive officer, who went below as soon as the first torpedoes hit, found him on the floor in the cabin next to the decoding room. This room was situated only 50 feet away from the point where that 1,000-pounder hit us. The blast had swept right across this deck, tearing down the steel bulkheads that divided the deck into cabins. In the room where Gilmore lay, the steel cabin separations had been pushed over, and it was the hot breath of this blast that felled him. Chaplain Markle, one of Gilmore's closest friends, immediately gave him artificial respiration in the hope that the blast had merely stunned him. The chaplain worked over him until Dr. White came along from the hospital and told him Gilmore was beyond all help. In the same cabin, orderlies had found a few minutes earlier the body of Commander Wadsworth C. Troyakovsky, the ship's dental surgeon. Both men had been together when the explosion occurred. Much of this wreckage included the Admiral's quarters where my cabin was. Immediately after the attack, I came down to get my typewriter and found all of this section devastated, still burning and soaked with chemical fire-extinguishing fluid. Before the battle, hundreds of 5-inch shells had been stacked all around to be near that since bombed gun position. These were now scattered throughout the whole section. Relatively few of them were exploded, but the continuing fire and heat caused their charges to swell. This pushed the projectile out of the brass powder cases of scores of them. Shortly after the projectile would fall away, the fire would get to the powder charges and burn with a great rushing shhh, throwing out a searing tail of flame. They reminded me of the giant firecrackers we used to break in half, and then light to see the powder hiss and burn. When I saw this wreckage, I inquired if anyone had seen Duke, the Admiral's pantry boy with whom I had become friendly during the time he took care of my cabin. I knew Duke had no other battle duty except to be in attendance upon the Admiral. During alerts, he used to sit in the tiny little pantry and play his accordion. When we searched, we found him there, annihilated by the first blast. Some of the happenings below, as seen through the eyes of Chaplain Markle, follow. I arrived on the main deck, 2 below the flight deck, to find dust and smoke drifting through the passageways coming from further aft. In the passageway, amidships, I found 4 men who were nearly naked looking for help. They were horribly burned. A Filipino cook who was there assisted me to get the men on the cots in the passageway and take off the remainder of their clothes, give them a drink of water and a morphine injection. A hospital corpsman came along and treated their burns with tannic acid jelly and took over their care. Men kept coming in from the 5-inch gun galleries, sometimes alone, others with the help of a comrade. We had about 12 men on the cots, and during a brief lull I went to the gun galleries to see what had happened. There I saw several cadavers. They seemed to have been frozen or charred into grotesque statues. Captain Ralph L. Hauser, United States Marine Corps, was there with a few surviving Marines manning No. 2 gun, which was still able to fire. At this time we felt we had the ship squared away once more, and we were pounding on northward, intending to close in for another attack during the afternoon. We had destroyed the enemy's carriers, eliminating his air defence, and now the rest of the fleet would be cold meat for the flyers. I was sitting in the navigating cabin, writing up the events of the morning from my notes when there came a jolt heavier than any of the explosions during the battle. Then, from deep down inside, the ship resounded the dull rumble of an explosion. It was just 12:45 p.m. The only other occupant of the room at the time was Chief Quartermaster Solomons. He was tending the ship's big book, and he carefully noted the fact of the jolt and the time, along with his other information. I looked at him. He looked at me. Each could see mirrored in the eyes of the other the unspoken question, "What was that?" I hurried below to see whether it was a mine, torpedo, or some of our own ammunition. There was no one in the wardroom, so I turned toward the junior officers' mess, 3 decks below the flight deck. There was a glow of fire. A gang of men were moving about with portable chemical extinguishers and leading hose lines down. I had no smoke mask, and the air was getting pretty thick with fumes and dense smoke clouds. It forced me to return to the wardroom, where I met some officers who had been on an inspection trip. "We think it was a sleeper bomb," they told me. "Probably one that hit us during the attack, penetrated to the lower decks, and only just now exploded." But this we soon learned was wrong. The first explosion was followed in 20 minutes by a second. Each one left fires behind it. The blazes began to spread throughout the lower region, and within a short time the full extent of that first internal blast's damage became visible. The explosion had occurred in the vicinity of Central Station. Central Station is the room from which all damage control is directed. It was Pop Healy's office, and he was in it at the time. The blast annihilated Pop and a number of his men who were on duty in that section. It marked the end of the combat phase of the battle with the Japanese, but was only the beginning of an even grimmer, more vicious trial of the Lexington's officers and men. During the next 5 hours, we suffered more casualties than we had in all the fighting against the Japanese. The bravery and gallantry of the crew was above and beyond the sort of valor that actuates men in the heat of slaying. These men already had been smashed and blitzed by 103 Japanese planes that did their darndest. But now, attacked from within by subtle enemies that fed upon the fuels and stores within the great valiant old ship, they rose to a second desperate fight. With dogged determination and unshakable courage, all members of the ship's company, from the humblest to the highest, strove together in a long, torturing, and deadly hazardous effort. If they had but known that the first shattering internal blast sounded the Lexington's death knell, they did not or refused to recognize it. For hours their efforts, in which flesh was seared from bone, in which men repeatedly were smashed to death against steel decks and bulkheads, as more and more explosions followed with ever-increasing frequency, warded off the heartbreaking finish. Many of them who fought on with such downright guts, and completely without heroics and without the compensation, the satisfaction of shooting back that battle brings, had been in the Navy for only a few months. They were choking and burning as they strove, unseen, deep inside the smoke-filled galleries of the lower decks. They were aware every second that the Lexington's own ammunition stores might shatter her at any moment, sending them to the bottom with her. Yet they never faltered. They battled on unselfishly. At least 600 aboard were on their first sea cruise. When the fight was over, the oldest tried sea dogs in the crew, from the chief petty officers to the captain, declared that these as yet unsalted tars had behaved like man-of-war's men, the fighting navy's highest tribute. No one person could have seen all there was to see aboard the Lexington during these final hours. I saw what I could and made straggling notes that later served merely to jog the memory. I talked to many Lexington men, and among them to Lieutenant H.E. Williamson, who was standing just outside the doorway to Central Control when the main blast shook us. There was a terrific explosion that seemed to be either in the internal communications, telephone switchboard, or Central Station, he reported. The concussion hurled me against the guardrail, which broke, and against the switchboard. Immediately following the explosion, a gale of wind with the force of a hurricane blew through the door from Central and pinned me to the board. The wind seemed to be made up of streams of flame and myriads of sparks, very similar to the flames of an explosion in a gasoline engine cylinder. The flames were between a cherry red and white, and the sparks were crimson. The gale lasted for only a few seconds and left nothing but heavy, choking fumes. I was already partially blinded by the flash and could not breathe because of the fumes. There were cries from the surrounding rooms, so I shouted at the top of my voice, "Take it easy and hold your breath, and we will all get out." Williamson said the lights remained on, but the corridors were so filled with the smoke and fumes that it was impossible to see far. He and the other men with him climbed out of the scuttle into the hangar deck and called for help. Crew came and began dragging out the injured and those overcome at central control, when, as Williamson tells it, the second blast occurred. After about 5 minutes, I again went down the scuttle and was standing over it when a minor explosion occurred seemingly in the machine shop, and smoke and flames came out onto the deck. I reported to the chief engineer that it must be gas fumes that were igniting. 11 men were brought out of that room through the efforts of Lieutenant Frederick W. Hawes and Ensign Rockwell. Lieutenant Hawes was overcome by smoke twice, but went back each time to direct his men. Williamson said the crew used plane handling dollies to remove the burned and injured to the after end of the hangar deck. While engaged in this, 2 more concussions occurred below. His conclusion that the blasts were gas fumes was borne out by the later analysis of our engineers. Their investigation showed the first explosion had been caused by the ignition of the highly volatile vapors escaping from our damaged 100-octane gasoline tanks, which seeped through fractured bulkheads. This first heavy blast tore strong steel watertight doors from their hinges and twisted massive steel hatches from bolts, thus opening up the decks below the waterline. Particularly, it smashed down every steel door in the compartments extending forward from central control, right through the junior officers' mess, the chief petty officers' mess, and to the main hospital 300 feet away, right in the bow. As soon as the blast punched open these airtight compartments, the gaps allowed air to circulate freely. The air-assisted combustion and fires on all the lower decks increased in intensity. Smashed doors and hatches prevented the burning quarters from being isolated until they burned out. The fires could not be shut off any longer, nor could they be extinguished with water, because the explosion had shattered the water mains that fed the fire hoses on these decks. Pumps, small electrically operated auxiliary pumps that were scattered all over the ship to provide pressure in any area, were useless without water. Then, before extra lengths of hose could be led in from undamaged sections of the ship, the fires consumed the electric mains, cutting off light and power where they were needed most. Hoses from remote auxiliary pumps still operating did not supply nearly enough water. All the available chemical extinguishers were rushed into use, but it was a losing and discouraging battle, for no sooner would the damage control make progress in one place than another explosion would occur and extend the burning area. By this time, the engineers were aware that the main fire was being fed from huge storage tanks in a section which could not be flooded, and the increase in frequency and violence of the explosions indicated all these blasts were further damaging the storage tank bulkheads, allowing a faster seepage of fuel oil and gasoline. This was evaporating in the heated air and either feeding the fire direct or forming vapor pockets that soon exploded and multiplied the damage still further. The first concussion that swept through the hospital threw Dr. White through a door to the deck, fracturing an ankle and severely injuring his shoulder. The doctor dragged himself back on his feet, however, and for the next 3 hours, while refusing to have his own hurts tended, he directed the hospital's work. Dense smoke rolled into the infirmary through the smashed compartments within a few minutes after that first blast. All patients were moved amidships to the captain's quarters, 2 decks above, where an emergency ward was set up. 2 hours later, they were driven out once more as the fire continued to spread through the Lexington's interior. This time they were moved to the forward flight deck, from where they ultimately were taken aboard a destroyer that came alongside. The first interference with the ship's navigation developed when the blast destroyed the telephone switchboard, disrupting communications throughout the ship. Speaking tubes were still in operation from the bridge to the engine room and to 1 or 2 other departments, but for the rest of the ship, messengers had to be used. The second interference came when the fire consumed the main electric cables, perhaps an hour later, about 1:50, putting the electric steering controls, centralized at the bridge, out of action. Normally, the Lexington was steered without a wheel and chains. A small hand lever, not unlike the power control of a streetcar motorman's, was electrically connected to a pair of motors right in the lowest reach of the ship in the aft compartment. Its movement on the bridge started one or the other, and they in turn operated a huge hydraulic ram that moved the ship's vast rudder. With the burning away of the main cables, there was no method of controlling the ship's movements, except by manning the auxiliary steering apparatus or trick wheel located in a blind position near the great rams. As long as the auxiliary speaking tube from the bridge to the trick wheel was functioning, Captain Sherman found the Lexington could be handled satisfactorily. Soon, however, the speaking tube also was destroyed by flames, and the bridge cut off from the wheel completely. The captain's temporary answer was the establishment of a live line of men extending from the trick wheel to the bridge and spreading over 450 feet of deck, 4 decks deep. Officers directed the steering orders to be passed by word of mouth as quickly as possible, but delay between the giving of an order and its execution was naturally unavoidable. Initially, the Lexington managed to hold her place in the formation of ships which had slackened speed as Admiral Frank Fletcher in Carrier 2 was informed of our troubles. Soon, however, her bow was yawing back and forth in unintentional zigzags. The yawing increased until eventually we became a menace to the other ships around us. "Open out formation around the Lexington and disregard her movements," came Admiral Fletcher's order to the flotilla. It was his instruction to them to stay out of our way because we were gradually losing control of her. Efforts to repair the electric lines to the rudder were being made, and one of the brave acts of the day was that of an electrician volunteer. These vital cables are strung down inside one of the legs of the tripod mast, a hollow steel tube about 2 feet in diameter. The electrician asked to be lowered on a rope down the mast leg to the point where the wires were ruptured so he could attempt to repair them. A sling was quickly rigged and a telephone connected to him. Then he disappeared down inside this black tube. The men paid out the lines swiftly as he descended. I would like to report that he was successful in getting those cables spliced, but when he reached a point where the fires were raging all round the outside of the tube, the heat was too much for human endurance. He gasped a word or two into the telephone and was drawn up quickly just before he collapsed. The loss of the main electric cables, which robbed Captain Sherman of steering control, also cut off the current to the thousands of electric bulbs that illuminated the interior of the ship. Pitch darkness that never afterward was lifted fell throughout her length. The men knew the corridors and passageways by heart, of course, but these were now clogged with debris, smoke and fumes. Battle lanterns were lighted, electric bullseye lanterns with high-powered lenses, but they could not penetrate more than a foot or so into the smoke. Every man below was wearing a smoke mask, and still some were overcome. At 2:30 p.m. there was another particularly violent explosion. It seemed to shake the ship all over. Into my notebook, where I was logging significant events, I found later I had written, "The End." This explosion wrecked the ventilation system of the fire and engine rooms. Ordinarily, they are swept by fan-driven blasts of air which keep the temperatures down to livable levels, about 100 to 105 degrees. Now, with the fans wrecked and the draft ceasing, the temperatures amid the great boilers with their hot oil fires and pounding machinery jumped quickly to 145 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. "We felt the explosions a lot more strongly toward the stern than you did amidships," one of the fire tenders told me afterward. The heat after the fans stopped turning affected us to a point where it was difficult to keep our minds clear. We became dizzy and had violent headaches. Captain Sherman asked of the navigating officer the distance to the nearest land and distance to the nearest point of Australia. A few minutes later came the command to plot a course to a designated point on the Australian coast, and Chief Quartermaster Solomons was working out this course when it became apparent that it was impossible to keep the men in the fire rooms any longer. At 4 p.m. the final orders to draw the fires and abandon the engine rooms were given. The orders were passed to Lieutenant Commander Mike Coffin, then in charge of the watch below. Coffin personally visited every nook and cranny in the boiler and engine rooms to see the men there got the word. He had them douse their fires. In the case of the Lexington, this was merely turning off the oil feed lines and open the safety cocks to allow the steam from the boilers to escape. The noise topside was terrific, as the steam from these 16 boilers roared up through the funnel. This sound was properly interpreted by all on the flight deck and above. The 4 great bronze propellers at our stern ceased turning, and slowly the great vessel coasted to a stop. All the normal exits from the engine room to the deck were cut off by fires, which by this time had spread aft to the hangar deck, and actually were burning right above the engine compartments. In order to see that every single member of their gangs got out, Commander Junkers and Coffins stayed to the last, directing their men through the intricate maze of narrow passages and emergency steel ladders that finally led to the open deck aft. The firefighting gangs, under the leadership of Commander Seligman, who took over when Pop Healy was annihilated, were still struggling against all odds. I came across Commander Seligman several times in different sections of the ship with his fire and rescue squads. Every explosion annihilated or burned some of his men. Others were getting their lungs full of the smoke or blinded by fumes. As the injured or blinded men were brought up to the flight deck for treatment, other men stepped forward, donned the smoke helmets taken from the casualties, and went below in their places. There never was a call for volunteers. There was no need. Men were waiting constantly on topside for a smoke mask to get down into the fight. By now, more than 25% of the below-decks area was a blazing inferno. Bulkheads adjoining burning sections turned red with heat and thick layers of paint. Repeated painting over 17 years had built these layers as deep as 1/8 of an inch, curled off, their burning flakes acting as agents which transferred their fire straight through even closed bulkheads into ever-new areas. The conflagration engulfed the machine shop where 20 armed bombs, all 1,000-pounders, were stowed. They had been made ready for loading onto our dive bombers in preparation of possible afternoon attacks. Further aft, there were stored 48 torpedo warheads filled with tons of the finest explosive the Navy knows how to make. This locker was on the hangar deck, and now in close proximity to the fire. One violent explosion occurred at the moment Seligman was starting through a manhole. It tossed him back like a feather caught in a draught. As one of the men who saw this and other narrow escapes Seligman had during the afternoon put it, the exec was continually being blown through doors and out of scuttles like a cork out of a champagne bottle. It was impossible to estimate the number of casualties caused by these fires, but our medical records show that at least half of our injured were burned in fires or explosions. Most of them suffered burns or combinations of burns when slammed against the bulkheads by blast. At 4:30 p.m., Captain Sherman sent a messenger to Seligman to get the men up from below, then commenced a hunt through smoke-filled, smouldering passages to make sure that every man on duty in the various compartments received the order. The loudspeaker system, which made it so easy to transmit orders while the ship was functioning normally, was gone when the electricity failed, so the job was one that had to be done methodically by men who groped from door to door and deck to deck. Some of these messengers went down to decks around and below the fires to pass on the word, for there were men in these lower regions on pumping stations and watching the water levels in the bilges who had to be told. There were many scenes of courageous action, as when Commander Seligman asked if there was anyone who knew his way to a certain station, then almost isolated by fire. A coloured mess boy stepped forward and said he would go. "Are you sure you know the way?" Seligman asked. "And do you fully realize the chances are that you might never get back?" "Yes, sir," answered the boy. "All right then," said the commander. "Thank you very much for offering to go. On your way and good luck. I will be here and you report to me when you get back." He made his way, found his men, and returned safely. It was just at this point I suffered a great personal disappointment. I found my way through the smoke to Commander Seligman's cabin to recover the recordings. In all, we had made a dozen or more records. The first of these from the squadron commanders on that wonderful attack on the Ryukaku. Then there were several that I had made during the attack on the Lexington, in addition to getting the stuff as it was happening, and getting onto the wax the sound of the Japanese bombs, plane engines, the torpedo explosions, and the sounds of our own guns. I had gone down when the attack was over and amplified everything with 15 minutes more of my own explanation. I had played these discs back and found them superb. I knew that this was a set of records of value to the Navy, and had hoped to secure one set for myself. Several times I had started down to get them, but always was sidetracked. When the order was given to get everybody up from below, I remembered them again, and this time went in through the smoke to the cabin. I was too late. Fire and explosions had gutted the executive's office. His recording machine was smashed, and everything else in the place was destroyed. I hurried to the chart room to gather some last-minute particulars to complete my notes. A small leather-cased chronometer lay on the desk, and thinking this was possibly the property of Commander Dudley, I offered it to him, but he said, "It has not worked for years." The figures showing the distance steamed since we entered the war I noted from the distance recorder, a gadget not unlike a car's speedometer, which also showed the ship's speed when moving. The Lexington's coffee pot was lying on the table, and I have regretted ever since not taking it to present to the captain later as a souvenir. After having gotten the latitude and longitude, about the only detail not available was the depth of that part of the Coral Sea into which we were about to plunge. The radio depth finder, which was also in the chart room, had caught my eye, but when I asked the quartermaster if we could use it to add this last detail, he mournfully shook his head. "It won't work. The power is off." In the radio room, one of the operators, having had nothing to do during the hours since his radio had gone out, was busy dusting the shelves and switchboards with a foxtail. A destroyer now came alongside to take off our wounded and give assistance to our firefighters. When it was found after the hoses had been rigged up that the flow of water was inadequate, the order came to have all men brought up to the flight deck. About 5 o'clock I was standing on the bridge when I saw Admiral Fitch lean over his upper balcony and call down to Captain Sherman, "Well, Ted, let us get the men off." That was the abandon ship order. Nothing dramatic about it, just the word of one good seaman to another. The Admiral could see as well as the captain that further efforts to save the Lexington were useless. They had both been told a few minutes earlier by Commander Seligman that a devastating explosion was imminent. The heat of our explosives was already far above the theoretical detonation point and might go off at any instant, as one of our flying officers discovered to his sorrow. He became curious about how the torpedo warheads were cooking and slipped into the hangar deck. Avoiding the fires as best he could, he reached the stacked torpedoes and laid his hand on the sleek nose of one, only to immediately jerk it away with an exclamation of pain. The metal casing had turned so hot it blistered his palm. Execution of the abandoned ship order was Seligman's duty. He at once got a score of different details of men busy. Some produced heavy lines that were secured to the flight deck net railing and streamed down into the water. Others got out huge donut rafts. These had a fat balsam wood perimeter, oval in shape, about 8 feet wide and 10 long. Inside was a wooden lattice floor attached by lines. When filled with men, the flooring sank several feet beneath the surface, leaving the men standing in water up to their waists. Still others checked off the men belonging to certain departments of the ship who were to go first, dealt out spare Kapok life jackets, and carried on the preliminary business which made the abandonment an orderly affair. Meanwhile, Admiral Fletcher on Carrier 2, his flagship, had been notified of the decision to abandon the Lexington. He answered by asking what assistance Captain Sherman would require, and after the captain signalled his reply, 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers were directed to stand in close and prepare to aid in taking the Lexington's crew off. The rest of the fleet continued on out toward the horizon. Carrier 2 had to keep moving to keep her patrols in the air. These were now doubly important because they formed the only air screen for the rest of us. Some of our own pilots were flying these patrols, for with his usual foresight, Captain Sherman, hours earlier, had ordered that as many of his aircraft as could be accommodated aboard Carrier 2 be flown to its deck. In this way, about 25% of all the Lexington's squadrons were saved for later battle. Only aircraft that had escaped battle damage were chosen. They represented a material reinforcement to Carrier 2 and more than replaced her losses. Almost as soon as the ropes had been rigged over the 50-foot high sides, men began dropping into the sea from where they climbed onto the rafts. It was about 5:15. One of the destroyers came alongside to starboard and took between 400 and 500 men aboard who climbed down the ropes to her deck. Ensign Martin, who had gone into the captain's smoke-filled cabin and had rescued the still cowering Wags from under the bed, now wrapped him, though undoubtedly the best swimmer on the carrier, into a life jacket and had Swift, the captain's marine orderly, lower him aboard the destroyer. As this destroyer, loaded with the Lexington's wounded and hundreds of her men, pulled away from us, there came spontaneously from her a roar which developed into 3 lusty cheers for Captain Sherman. It was an amazing and uplifting thing there in those grim moments. The men who cheered were the men the skipper had led into battle. They knew he was the stuff, and they cheered him to the end. Most of the men lowered themselves to water level on the port side aft. The ship drifted away from them as she floated downwind and left a stream of swimmers and loaded rafts strung out for nearly 1,000 yards. All the vessels except one cruiser and the destroyer standing to our starboard formed up along this line of men and pulled them aboard as quickly as possible. But even working rapidly at this, it took a long time to bring the men aboard because each destroyer and cruiser had only one power whaleboat. In wartime, Navy craft are stripped of small boats when they go to sea, hence the types of rafts used by the Lexington. In all, the abandonment of the ship was spread out over more than 2 hours. It allowed those of us who stayed behind to see most of the men off, and gave us plenty of time to have a last look around and to note everything that took place. There was calmness and order. Men would go to the edge of the flight deck, look over and then shrug their shoulders and come back. Someone would ask, "Not going over yet?" They would reply, "Oh no, it is too crowded still. I will wait till they thin out a bit." I had another walk around the gun deck. The forward port gun platform, where the big bomb had dropped, was a shambles, and it amazed me that any of the crew had remained alive to handle the single gun left after that catastrophe. Amidships on the port side had been a small steel sponson, hinged at the bottom so that it opened outward to form the floor of a 4 20mm gun battery. I found it slammed and jammed shut, although all the others were open. Later I learned that a bomb had almost grazed this platform while its crew of 12 were working their guns. The bomb went into the sea directly beneath, and the blast had wanged the heavy steel sponson shut. The men were thrown sprawling to the deck inside the ship. They jumped to their feet, took their detachable gun barrels and ammunition to the next position, after finding the sponson so buckled it could not be reopened, and rejoined the fight. Back, on the aft 5-inch gun position, where the gun crew were still standing by on the chance of a late-afternoon Japanese attack, I heard of the casualties they had suffered from machine guns and bomb splinters. They told me one of their men was busy feeding 5-inch shells from the ammunition hoist into the automatic fuse setter when a wave of torpedo planes sprayed them with machine gun fire and passed on. This man went right on working, lifting 2 more of these heavy shells from the hoist to the setter, before suddenly dropping dead. He must have been hit minutes before, and yet kept right at his job. On the starboard, a second destroyer had come alongside to pick up more wounded. I found the gunners busily handing down whole sling loads of 20mm gun barrels. These are replaceable when they get hot with much firing and clips of ammunition. The gunners knew that the destroyer used the same type of light quick-firing gun, and instead of letting them go down with the ship, they dismounted them so as not to be wasted. The heavier 5-inch ammunition was being tossed into the sea to prevent it from exploding, because the fires were now beginning to reach their store. When I got back to the flight deck, I ran into Commander Hamilton, who had gathered around him the flyers, mechanics, gunners, and aircraftsmen of his squadron. He was giving them a general talk on the fortunes of war, a sort of classroom lecture out there on a deck that already was burning their feet from the blazes below. One of his mechanics had just come up to report he had completed fitting a new wobble pump to the commander's plane. In jest, Ham said, "Took you a long time?" The man replied, "Yes, sir. I had to draw a new one from the store and had an awful job to get to it. There is a terrible big fire down there." Ham grinned and continued his discussion. He told the assembled group, who stood or sat around him in postures of ease. "The squadron has been in many battles, and to date has not lost a man. And yet we have wreaked heavy toll on the enemy. We have got to hand it to our maintenance crew and chiefs, because we had no mechanical trouble in all our flights over the enemy. We got through because we all stuck together, and when attacked we defended each other. We were scattered all about under the wings of planes, most of which bore bullet scars from this day's action. Someone called over to us, "There is plenty of ice cream over here if any of you care for it." It developed that some bright lads, remembering the ice cream from the ship's service canteen would soon go to Davy Jones's locker, had gone below and brought up several armloads of gallon cans. They even remembered to bring a supply of paper cups and wooden spoons. It was most welcome because the scuttlebutts, water-drinking fountains, had been dry since 1 a.m. Now standing on the hot decks with the sun still beating down, the ice cream was delicious and refreshing, particularly so as we had been unable to get any real meal after breakfast. We were at battle stations during lunchtime, and while the cooks had made up sandwiches and coffee to be passed around with apples during the afternoon, most of us were hungry. I stayed with Ham for quite a while, eating my ice cream, and heard him exchange jokes with his pilots about the plane he customarily flew. This machine had developed a peculiar quirk. The electric synchronizing gear governing the firing of one of the forward guns had gotten out of tune, and Ham repeatedly shot holes in his propeller. All sorts of efforts to correct this were made, because each time it cost the ship a new propeller, and propellers do not grow like mushrooms. They changed the synchronizing gear, checked the electrical system, and on the night of May 7th, even changed the engines. On the morning of the 8th, this aircraft was flown by Lieutenant Robert B. Buchan. Before he took the air, the new chief warned him that the ship's last propeller of the proper type was on the plane. When he returned to the Lexington some hours later, the crew was disgusted to see, as the engine stopped, the usual holes in the propeller. But Buchan told his story. He intercepted a Japanese torpedo plane and lined it up before he remembered the difficulty with the guns. He hesitated only a moment, however, before squeezing his trigger. There was the usual jar and vibration as the guns fired. This time he did not mind. The Japanese went down a fire. He figured that he had shot the Japanese down with part of the prop, as well as with the slugs. Some of the flyers were getting out their little yellow rubber boats and giving them to the mechanics who now were sliding down the lines. These craft carry one man most buoyantly, and a number of boys who used them did not even get their feet wet. One crew chief in Ramsey's squadron got into his little rubber boat and commenced to paddle away, his cap at a jaunty angle and his flare pistol at his side. Ramsey whistled to him, and the man sculled his way back to ask, "What do you want, skipper?" "Nothing," said Ramsey. "Just wanted to say you look fine and that it is only 400 miles to Australia." Commander Duckworth came along and remarked, "My word, you have got a real story to tell your paper now, haven't you?" "Yes," I replied, "and you have not given me a contribution yet." "Here is one. We handled the Lexington during the last hour she was under steam, just like Columbus handled the Santa Maria." He grinned. "We had lost our steering, communication, and gyro compass, and our gyro pilot. We were back on the old magnetic compass and were steering by hand with directions passed by word of mouth. Commander Junkers told us how a rookie had reported on one of the early torpedo hits. The boy telephoned in to damage control to say a torpedo had holed his compartment right on the waterline, with the greater part of the hole above water. "Why don't you plug it up?" the hard-boiled chief petty officer demanded. "I cannot," the boy replied. "It is that big I can see a cruiser through it." "Then shut the door and forget it," the chief petty officer admonished. There were only a few men left on deck. Just leaving was Lieutenant Gaylor. He dived off the 50-foot-high deck into the water and swam out about 100 yards. Then I saw him turn round, swim back, and in a few minutes he had climbed one of the ropes and reappeared. "What did you come back for?" one of the flyers asked. "Oh, I got a bit lonely out there. I did not know any of those guys. When are you fellows going to come?" he replied. At no time was there any hurry or scramble to get off the ship. A roll call taken later revealed that 92% of the Lexington's personnel had been saved. Captain Sherman discovered when his records were completed that only 8% of the original complement were missing. It is believed that all of these were the victims of air fighting, bombing and torpedoing, and finally of firefighting and internal explosions. The captain believes that every man who was alive when the abandon ship order was given was rescued. I did a last turn round the deck with Lieutenant Commander Edward Eldridge, air officer for the ship. While we walked, we met Lieutenant Commander Brett, who looked somewhat worried. Earlier in the day, as he alighted from his attack on the Japanese, I had chided him because he had not shaved. Now his beard was longer still, and I reprimanded him. "What, not shaved yet?" "Heck," he answered, "I have nothing to shave with." That bomb completely destroyed my cabin. Worse still, it burnt that manuscript I showed you last night. There went 2 years' work. Jimmy said that as far as he could learn, the last of his men had gone off, and he was going off too. We thought it a good idea, so Eldridge and I took up a position on the starboard quarter and waited until an empty boat from a cruiser lying off that side approached us. My preparations for going over consisted of transferring all notes to the breast pocket of my shirt where I hoped they would stay dry. Then, selecting a rope with a big knot at its end, I cautiously lowered myself down hand over hand. Eldridge was a bit careless in securing his grip, and he did a trip to the water in one scorching flash that left him with blistered palms and a friction burn on one leg. I climbed into a raft and then across into a whaleboat with others. This boat towed several filled life rafts to the cruiser where all disembarked. I stayed aboard the cutter with the coxswain and we started off again to pick up another load. This time we headed out on the port side where there were a number in the water who had been swimming for a long time. Those on rafts would be safe till we could get round to them, but some of these others were near exhaustion and soon would be in trouble if not gathered up. We chugged across the stern of the Lexington, ignoring all rafts, and while the coxswain handled the engine and rudder, I began heaving swimmers into the boat. The first one we picked up was Lieutenant George Raring, ship's meteorological officer who was swimming strongly, wearing only his skivvies. He and his wife were good friends of mine, and to my greeting, "Home was never like this, eh, George?" He came back with, "This is a fine time to remind a man of home." We were hauling them in thick and fast and had almost gotten 60 aboard when we ran up alongside Ensign H.B. Schonk of Scouting 2. He was swimming on his side with one hand raised high, holding a water bottle, empty as we discovered later, and a tin of 50 cigarettes out of the sea. He held them up, saying, "Take these quick, Mr. Johnston." I took them and tossed them into the boat over my shoulder among the already rescued, many of whom lay on the bottom trying to cough the seawater out of their lungs. A second or so later, after he was pulled aboard, Schonk was pounding me on the back. He had found the cigarettes and was holding one in his lips. "Have you got a match?" he questioned. I did not. Then, "Has anybody got a match?" As we again passed the Lexington's stern on our way back to the cruiser, there was a heavy explosion aboard her that sent the amidships portion of the flight deck hurtling into the air. Flames burst through. Almost immediately there came another blinding flash, a tremendous shock and a billowing cloud of black smoke soaring skyward as the 1,000-pound bombs exploded. Bits of the steel deck and side plates showered the sea for hundreds of yards around, endangering all in the water and boats. I later learned that Commander Seligman and Captain Sherman were still on ropes, just making their way off the Lexington when this blast shook them loose and threw them into the sea. Only a few minutes later, the aftertip of the flight deck was blasted away. Planes were tossed into the water when the torpedo warheads let go. Captain Sherman and Commander Seligman were swimming to a cutter when this happened, from where they were transferred to a cruiser already crowded with more than 800 Lexington survivors. They were the last men off and had just made one more final inspection to see that everyone else was clear. Seligman told me of this later. "We were walking back to the stern and I was urging the skipper to hurry because I knew those bombs were overdue. He seemed to be thinking and suddenly stopped, asked me to wait a minute and trotted over to the island. I saw him go into his emergency cabin for a minute, and as he came out a minute later, he was firmly adjusting his number 1 cap to his head, the one with the newest and heaviest gold braid. He grinned as we walked over to the side and said, 'I hear there is not to be any more gold braid till after the war, and I would not like to have to use that yellow cotton substitute. Thought I had better save my best one.' Seligman tells that when they reached the stern, the skipper ordered him to lower away. He selected a rope and started down, but Captain Sherman stood above him, musing as he looked back over the smoking ship. "Come on, skipper, do not wait any longer," Seligman urged him. Captain Sherman looked down at him and slowly replied, "I was just thinking, would not I look silly if I left this ship and the fires went out? The water of the Coral Sea is hot, one might say. The Lexington's automatic seawater thermometers registered it as about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, only a few degrees lower than blood heat. These waters also rightfully merit the description of shark-infested, for enormous ferocious sharks of all sizes and varieties range the reefs and follow vessels that cross the Coral Sea. From the Lexington, our lookouts, who suspected each curling whitecap as the periscope wake of a submarine and whose vigilant gaze ranged the surface of the waters day and night, had seen thousands of sharks in the few days just preceding our final battles. So every man on the ship rather expected that if the time ever came when he would have to abandon ship, those sharks would be a menace. If we ever had to swim in this ocean, the sharks would get us. The deck crew used to assure one another in their leisure moment huddles. The Navy calls this shooting the breeze. But when the time really came, and we were abandoning the Lexington by the thousands, not a shark was to be seen. Neither we, watching from the flight deck, nor the sharp eyes of lookouts on the rescue vessels, ever saw a fin or the betraying flicker of a tail. Several explanations were offered. One group held that it was pure luck, the luck of a lady, as the Lexington was often referred to. The more analytical, however, attributed the total absence of sharks to the fact that they were frightened off by the repeated heavy explosions in the great hull. These blasts, which shook the whole 46,000 tons of her several times a minute toward the end, travelled for great distances through the water. Any heavy underwater explosion exterminations fish for hundreds of feet around because fluid transmits shock over long distances. Air is compressible, so explosions soon lose their force, but water is incompressible and spreads explosive shocks further. To this fact, we probably have to attribute the disappearance of the denizens of the deeps. It was into this clear, warm water that Captain Sherman and his executive officer plunged when the bomb blast amidships shook them off their hemp ropes. Both men spluttered a bit and then began swimming toward a whaleboat, searching for the last few men still in the water. Both were unceremoniously hauled aboard, the skipper still wearing his gold braid-loaded No. 1 cap. Reminiscing about this a few weeks later, after he had been made a rear admiral and was called to Washington from San Diego, he told me, "The boys picked me up by one arm and the seat of my breeches and hauled me over the gunwale to drop me flat on my face. That is about the only way you can pull a man out of the water." "Yes, that is true," he drawled, smiling, "but I thought they might have a more elegant way of bringing a captain aboard." It was 6:30 p.m. now and almost dark, as night descends quickly in the tropics. The sun had dropped into the sea and the rescue work was nearly over. Our whaleboat was filled with weary swimmers, some of whom were very ill after having swallowed seawater on top of ice cream, and was disembarking its cargo. All the men except Ensign George Markham and myself had climbed the boarding netting dropped from the cruiser's deck when there was another terrific explosion, one of the heaviest of all, aboard the Lexington. The 16,000 to 20,000 pounds of torpedo warhead gun cotton finally had detonated. "Everybody take cover!" came the shout from the deck officers. George and I stole one look at the poor old Lexington and saw bits and particles, airplanes, plates, planks, pieces large and small, all going up into the air in the midst of a blinding white flame and smoke. We pressed lovingly against the heaving steel sides of that cruiser, hugging her for seconds while the debris splashed into the sea for hundreds of feet around. But even then, the apparently indestructible old Lexington did not sink. Instead, she began to burn harder than ever. The flight deck was now ripped wide open from stern to stern. Apparently, this last blast had ruptured great holes in the oil and fuel tanks, for the flames now were shooting hundreds of feet high up into the air, where they were crowned by thick black smoke. In the deepening twilight it was a sight of awful majesty, one that wrung the hearts of all who watched. After clambering aboard, I finally went down to the cruiser's laundry to get myself thoroughly dried. There I met a friendly Marine who was in charge and who loaned me, at his own suggestion, shirt and pants while my own scorched and torn uniform was being washed and dried. My shoes, a favourite pair I had bought in London while covering the Battle of Britain, were put into a hot air dryer. I got them back within an hour, none the worse for the soaking. While I was waiting for a dry change of clothing, I fished from my pockets sheaves of loose leaf notes and my little black notebook. By drying those in the laundry's steam presser, I saved everyone, and was grateful to find that my hen tracks were still legible, though blurred. These were the only items I had salvaged. My watch, money, clothing, typewriter, my valuable toothpaste tube, 6 weeks later in Washington, District of Columbia. When I tried to buy a tube, I was refused because I could not produce the old one, and my favourite straight razor had gone down. I then went back on deck. Night had fallen. It might have been a starry night, but none of us could tell. The leaping, towering flames from the Lexington hid all feebler light from the skies. Every bit of flotsam and every outline of the great ship showed up in a blinding glare. Around her, the velvety tropic night was the deeper for the contrast. 2 destroyers were easing slowly around her burning bulk, nosing in here and there to be sure no one was left in the water. At 7:15 p.m., Admiral Fletcher aboard Carrier 2 gave a signal for the fleet to reform and move away. We had been lying there immobile for at least 3 hours, the best way of asking for trouble in submarine-infested waters. It was time for us to go, but the ships moved off slowly as though reluctant to leave their gallant comrade. We did not leave her entirely alone. One destroyer stayed behind, circling around her now cherry-red hull and the maelstrom of fire within her bosom. It was evident that she might burn for hours before sinking. What a signal beacon in the darkness she made! Japanese subs or snooper planes could see her for 100 miles or more and pinprick our position on their charts without any difficulty. So the Admiral gave orders to sink her. That lone remaining destroyer did the job. Standing off 1,500 yards, her crew sent 4 torpedoes coursing, this time into the starboard side. Their explosions were almost lost in the terrific updrafts created by her fires. But their effect was not. She had been settling slowly through the hours, almost on an even keel. Now she shook herself as the torpedoes pierced her last internal ramparts. Clouds of steam began to hiss upward with the flames. Her white-hot plates groaned and screamed as the water caused them to shrink and buckle. Inside her there were new blasts, rumblings, concussions as pressures caved in bulkheads, as gasoline vapours exploded, and now the settling was more rapid. Still she remained upright, dipping neither bow nor stern. Gradually the waves folded over her. One of her officers standing beside me, watching this final act, murmured, "There she goes. She did not turn over. She is going down with her head up. Dear old Lexington, a lady to the last." And so we went down to eat. A man has to eat. As I walked into the wardroom, there rose mingled cheers and friendly boos. It stopped me for a moment until I looked around, and there, for heaven's sake, were all the familiar faces with whom I had been dining all those weeks on the Lexington. It looked as if we were back on her, except for the fact that the room was a different shape. Right there I realized that the Lexington still lived in the spirit of the crew who had manned her. They would carry on. The whole wardroom was cheery. All those friendly, sunburned, unshaven, ugly mugs. They had fed, they had seen every man led to laden mess tables, and now were relaxing as guests of the cruiser's officers and men. For the sake of her so hospitable company, it is too bad the name of this smart cruiser cannot be mentioned. Nothing was too much. They shared everything they had with us. Everyone, right through the ship, opened clothing lockers and duffel bags to us. They handed out uniforms, skivvies, singlets, dungarees, shoes, and best of all, their beds. Cigarettes and cigars by the carton and the box went our rounds. Cola, ice cream, all those little delicacies that mean so much to a crew cut off from land by long periods of sea duty were forced upon us, and our money was no good on that ship. After dinner I fell into conversation with the supply officer, who among other things asked if I had a place to sleep. He was way ahead of me, for I had not even looked around yet. He offered me his bunk with, "Well, you can use my cabin. I won't be turning in for a couple of nights because I have to get this ship squared away." He showed me to it, and then got out his Navy regulations to see what were our rights under the circumstances. He found one paragraph under shipwrecked mariners, which allowed him to supply each one of the 800 of us with clothing, bedding, towel, toothbrush, toothpaste, soap and razor. And he immediately ordered his staff to get busy stretching the ship's available stores as far as they would go. Straight through, the list arrangements were made for the cruiser's crew man for man, to house and bed their opposite number from the Lexington. For instance, the captain of the cruiser took into his cabin Captain Sherman. The cruiser's executive officer took in with him Commander Seligman. The chief engineer of the cruiser threw open his quarters to Commander Heiner Junkers, and so on down, all were bedded in exactly the same manner. The Lexington's gunners doubled up with the cruiser's gunners. Her engine room bunked with the cruiser's engineers, the black gang with the cruiser's black gang. Our Marines went in with the cruiser's Marine unit, our signalmen with theirs. The cruiser could even accommodate Admiral Fitch and his staff, for though there were quarters for an admiral on the cruiser, no admiral had been aboard. Now our admiral and his staff moved in. The situation with our pilots was a little different. The cruiser's complement was 8 pilots, whereas we brought on board dozens from our squadrons. The cruiser's airmen nevertheless absorbed as many as they could into their own cabins, and arranged accommodations for the others wherever these could be found. It meant, however, putting down cots in galleries and passageways, and in some cases mattresses on deck. One arrangement, made among the men, impressed me. On the cruiser there had been a bed for every man in her crew. Now the crew voluntarily doubled up. 2 men with opposite watches would turn over one bed to a Lexington man. The other bed between them would be used, watch and watch, since when one was off duty, the other always was on. I went down to the crew's mess decks to see if I could find any of my friends among the enlisted men. Scores of them were sitting around contentedly, puffing on cigarettes and talking. I asked the lot, "How are you getting on in this ship? Are you all fixed for beds and feeling all right?" "How could we help but feel all right?" they replied. "With all this wonderful hospitality, they have practically given us the ship." That evening the cruiser's band got together and gave off some hot music for our jitterbugs, boogie-woogie hounds and hot licks experts. The lieutenant who edited this cruiser's newspaper offered to get out a special Lexington issue if some of the rest of us would help him with the material. We held a meeting and assigned several Lexington men to write stories about the carrier, and finally put out an 8-page issue. The front page held a drawing of a Minuteman from Concord Common, the Lexington's crest, for she was known as the Minuteman's ship. This symbolic figure stood on a silhouette of the Lexington herself. Beneath her was the old quotation, "Light lie the sea upon thee." Page 2 held a short poem by Lieutenant Commander Weldon Hamilton. "We saw her live gloriously. Her memory will give, to all who saw her noble end, strength this nation to defend." With it were messages from Admiral Fitch and Captain Sherman. I think they bear repeating here. "To the officers and men of the Lexington," wrote the Admiral, "I want to express my highest admiration for your performance in action and conduct during the day when every effort was made to save the ship. You have upheld the highest traditions of the Navy. We were opposed by at least 3 carriers of the enemy against our 2. They lost 2 for our 1. It is my hope the crew of the Lexington will be kept together to commission another Lexington, which will return to avenge the loss of our ship. I am honoured to have served with you in action, and hope to be with you again." Captain Sherman penned the following words. "I have never experienced such hospitality and warm-hearted treatment as we have received on the United States ship. I speak for all of us from the Lexington in saying we are deeply grateful. Our sorrow at the loss of our ship is softened by the reception we have received. The Lexington was a grand ship that we all loved. We hope we can be kept together as a unit and man a new Lexington. Before we lost our ship, the enemy paid dearly many times over. We are proud of our record and to have been associated in these operations with such fine comrades in arms as the officers and men of the United States ship." Page 3 of the paper was a short history of the Lexington by Chief Boatswain's mate John B. Brandt, who had been aboard her since before her commissioning, and a cartoon of a gob drinking a toast. "She lived as proudly as she fell. May all the damned Japanese go to hell." The AC-Ducey tournaments aboard the Lexington, temporarily postponed, as the writer said, were described on page 4. Page 5 contained sidelights of the last hours of the Lexington, and the last 3 pages were given up to the Lexington's war history, which I sat up all night to compile and pound out on a borrowed typewriter so that the paper could be printed by morning. What a life we morning newspapermen have! At the foot of that last page was a sea scene with a wreath floating on the waters and the inscription, "Adieu." About midnight, Commander Seligman appeared in pyjamas. He had been put to bed by the doctor as soon as he staggered aboard the cruiser. The pounding he had gotten in the explosions as he led the Lexington's damage control gangs in their 5-hour fight, the strain and exertion and the fumes and smoke he had breathed, had worn him to exhaustion. Taking over one corner of the wardroom, he requisitioned a few of his officers and commenced to gather a list of our survivors. He also asked that a Lexington officer aboard each of the other rescue ships compile a complete list of all the Lexington men aboard their ships the first thing in the morning. Then he asked the doctors for similar lists of the wounded. Finally, he asked all officers to turn in reports of men they knew had been annihilated in air fighting or aboard. Thus began the long task of preparing the mountainous paperwork required by the Navy after a ship's demise. In the hospital, the doctors were going top speed, working over 60 of our wounded. They were setting bones, preparing splints and casts, using tannic acid jelly on burns, and treating bullet and bomb splinter wounds. The operating room was filled right through the night. The same scene was being repeated on other ships with us. Probably twice the number again of those hospitalized, who suffered from minor injuries and lesser burns, were treated and then returned to their own bunks. It truly amazed me to see men severely burned, apparently sleeping peacefully. The doctors explained that as soon as these men were brought in, the affected areas were lavishly covered with tannic acid jelly. Besides having a soothing effect, it formed a skin which protected the burned tissue. At the same time, morphine injections were given against the suffering of pain from the burn. Those very badly burned were given plasma transfusions primarily to replace lost fluids and to offset the shock of their injuries. This combination of treatments tremendously reduced the percentage of lives formerly lost from deep, large-area burns. And when properly and immediately applied, the jelly enables the skin to heal almost without the formation of scar tissue. "But don't you have to struggle hard for the lives of some of these patients, Doctor?" I asked, remembering my own battle experience and the scenes in British hospitals less than a year before. "No," he replied. "Once we get the boys all fixed up, the new sulfur drugs and the use of plaster casts, which eliminate the continuous dressing of wounds, turns doctoring largely into a matter of watching cases, feeding them, and giving them time to heal. A sailor, you must remember, lives and dresses cleanly on his ship at sea and is subjected to a minimum of polluted air. It is not like trying to treat soldiers who must live in dust or in the ground. There is little likelihood of complicating infection with sailors." Returns on the Lexington survivors that began to come in at this time showed some of the ships were badly overloaded. One destroyer, for instance, housed more than 400 of Boer men in quarters that were already crowded by the ship's wartime crew. The presence of all these men, scattered widely throughout the fleet, interfered with the fighting ability of the flotilla at large. Admiral Fletcher was anxious to free as many of his ships as possible to have them ready for instant combat, and so ordered a reshuffling and reconcentration of the men. This was carried out at sea while the fleet continued to hold its cruising speed, and although somewhat spectacular, it was neither difficult nor dangerous. The procedure was about as follows. 2 ships, from or to which men are to be transferred, are brought close together, about 50 yards apart. Each shoots a line to the other by rocket gun. These are rigged well above the deck and generally attached to the upper structures so that the lines are clear of the water in their sag. A mailbag then is attached to the lines and pulled back and forth from one ship to the other. In our case, the men were transferred 2 to a bag. A single bag can transfer an average of 80 men an hour or better than 1 a minute. A number of these transfers were carried out simultaneously on a number of the vessels until the dispositions desired by the Admiral had been made. On the 4th day, May 12th, we pulled into the French harbour of Noumea, New Caledonia. The government of this port recently had declared itself for Free France, and several thousand American troops had landed there only a day or so before. Here we were shifted to a new group of United States warships that carried us to a more westerly island port. Behind us we left our friends of Carrier 2 and their escorts. All this time no one had been allowed ashore. We did not know for certain whether the enemy knew we had lost the Lexington, and we were not going to simplify matters by helping them find out. When we reached the second island port, we all were changed again to transports that had brought a United States Army garrison to defend a Pacific Island group against Japanese encroachment. We remained for 4 days before starting our final trek hack home, during which time men and officers got leave in rotation so that everyone could have 4 hours ashore to get dust on his boots. The port town was a tiny, hot and dry little place under British administration. The few little native stores were almost devoid of goods, because their usual supply ships had not called on them for months. While strolling, I met a fine, upstanding native who told me he was a member of the island queen's bodyguard. The queen had moved out of her palace, taking all her native subjects far inside the island, and there set them to work growing food and vegetable crops for themselves and the American soldiers. She had given over her palace, a big white-painted stone house, and all the houses of the town to the troops. Her bodyguard said he was glad to see the Americans arrive, because before, when they had no army, they had been much afraid that Japanese planes would come and bomb them. Now they felt much safer with soldiers and airplanes protecting their island. He said that in the past many nationalities had come to his island, Germans, French, English and New Zealanders, but he liked the Americans best because they were always laughing and joking, The only items procurable ashore were grass mats, grass bags, and tapa cloth. Only small quantities of these were left because our advance guard, the army, had bought most of the stocks. Ordinarily, these native products sold at prices ranging from 25 to 50 cents apiece. Now, with sales booming, the native craftsmen had an entirely new price range. Their quotations were $1, $2, $3. The Lexington men, for the first time really relaxing, found to their complete disgust that the liquor store had long since sold its counters and shelves dry. They went around hopefully, however, sampling coconut juice and oranges by way of compensation. Some of them spent their shore leave scampering around on hired horses. After doing the town, I spotted a fine new vessel, a large merchantman, flying the Dutch flag in the harbour. This brought back fond memories of quaint places I had visited in Holland, memories of The Hague and Amsterdam, where I had lived for a spell and where Netherlanders had become my friends. On the basis of this friendship, I went out to visit the captain and, if possible, to beg, buy, borrow or steal a bottle of his scotch. I was taken aboard and greeted by Captain Van Dulken, a stout, beaming sea veteran who, like so many of his countrymen, spoke excellent English. We got on famously at once. He was entertaining another Dutch captain, W.H. Berger, whose ship also was in the port. Both of us paid proper reverence to Captain Van Dulken's excellent bowls, Holland gin, and were invited to stay to dinner. The captain had several young Americans with him who manned the ship's guns. These boys always dined at the captain's table, and that evening we were a merry little crowd. The dinner, too, was a memory of Holland. Fine Dutch cooking, well served in the luxurious and serious manner with which good food and drink is, or was, appreciated in that country. Every course was accompanied by the right wine, and when we reached dessert and champagne, there was only one toast left, to the United Nations. For the captain, this was a particularly happy evening, for that day he had received a letter that had followed him around the world for 15 months. It announced the marriage in Holland of his son, and was written by his new daughter-in-law, who commenced it to his vast delight. "Dear Daddy." "Fancy," he laughed. "This little girl I used to know running around in pigtails has married my son, and now is my daughter. They wanted to wait until I could come home, but with the war being what it is, who knows when I will get back to Holland. I am glad they went ahead with it." When we slipped out of this port, every man from the Lexington, except 8 wounded, whose cases were judged too seriously to be moved, were in our convoy. Commander Seligman had insisted that only those whose lives would be endangered should be left behind. His word to the doctors again and again was, "I want to take every man home that is fit to travel. The best medicine you can give them is the knowledge that they are going home." Some of us had made book on the bet that we would be kept in this little port for months, to hide the loss of the Lexington. We were paying off now and delighted to do it. The days were lazy and long. We were homeward bound, with nothing to do but eat and sleep until we arrived. Naturally, conversations turned to the war, to new and future developments, and to appraisals of Japanese equipment, methods, personnel, and the Japanese mind. This time we had our own ideas to draw on. Our men had fought the Japanese themselves, had met them in their Zeros and bombers, and had seen the enemy's fleet. With anything like even odds, they knew they could handle them. This and similar topics were expounded and milked dry until finally we arrived back at a West Coast port. I suppose one could go on forever, were one to relate every incident, every conversation, and every action, but even a book has only limited space. For every name mentioned, there were countless others who could have served equally well as examples to illustrate the valor of our airmen and ship's crew. One group was no more brave, daring, or self-sacrificing than another. It was impossible to see and record everything that merited recounting. But if this serves to convey to the reader the knowledge that Americans have not forgotten how to fight, and shows that the boys of today are as good and as valiant as earlier heroes in our national history, the book has served its purpose.